Order, order. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Daniel Zeichner to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Roger. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 212174 relating to rescinding Article 50 if the Vote Leave campaign broke electoral laws regarding the 2016 referendum. Sir Roger, this petition raises an issue that is clearly timely, it's lively, it's of huge interest, with almost 200,000 people having signed it in under 3 months, including over 1,000 from my own constituency of Cambridge. And I rather thought it was likely that many honourable members would be wishing to contribute. I thought some of them possibly on the subject of the petition, possibly on subjects related, possibly to confirm pre-existing positions, and I have to confess that I am no exception. I also suspect there will be a few people wishing to intervene, and as Mr. Speaker would probably put it, beetle away. I entirely understand, and I will be generous with interventions, but to avoid being knocked off course completely, I thought I'd set out the ground I intend to cover, and honourable members may judge for themselves where best their intervention might sit. May I say at the outset that the wording of the petition is admirably succinct and to the point, perhaps unlike some of our proceedings. But it says, I suspect, what many people would assume to be obvious. To paraphrase, it roughly says, if someone cheats, then the result is invalid and it doesn't count. Now, because I didn't like the result, I obviously agree entirely. But unfortunately for me, and for all of those who feel like me, it is sadly a little bit more complicated than that, and it is those issues that I wish to explore initially. I will suggest in passing that sadly, cheating in elections or allegations as such are not new and are not rare. I will explore the mechanisms that we have to explore such charges and the sanctions and punishments that may be involved, and whether they are consistent across different types of elections and votes. I will say a little about the particular circumstances surrounding the 2016 referendum campaign, and I will then address the issue of Article 50 and the views about the potential options open to us. In passing, I will reflect on the complicated issues of consent within a democracy and the extent to which some of these judgments are legal issues, but some may ultimately be political. I shall conclude in a completely non-partisan way by saying that, of course, we were cheated, the whole thing has been a nonsense, and we should stay in the European Union, which I suspect is what the vast majority of those signing the petition feel. Now, I do recognise that there may be others in the room who feel differently. On a more serious note, I will try to offer a potential way forward to address what has undeniably been a distinctly fraught couple of years for our politics. But let me start at the beginning. Last week I had the pleasure of joining the Lord Mayor of the City of London at an event in Cambridge. I was very struck by his opening comments. He said he is guided by 3 principles. The first principle he is guided by is the rule of law. The second principle he is guided by is the rule of law. And the third principle he is guided by is the rule of law. Now, given that he is addressing a group of lawyers, that seemed like quite a smart opening. But it does strike me that in this place, that is something we can probably all agree on. We are here as lawmakers, and we respect the law, even if we disagree with some of it and seek to change it. But we do respect it. So the opening part of the petition, querying whether any laws have been broken, should be relatively simple. We have a mechanism established by Parliament to supervise electoral contests. The Electoral Commission has conducted an extensive investigation and has concluded that laws were indeed broken. Vote Leave funnelled nearly £700,000 to another campaign group, Believe, and did not declare that the campaign groups were working together. Now, the precise details of what happened remain contested. Others may wish to talk about that. And I do recognise that Vote Leave argue that the investigations have been politically motivated. But the investigation has been done, and the conclusion's very clear and stark. Vote Leave was referred to the police, and those found guilty have been fined, the punishment that is available to the Electoral Commission under the law. Now, the Electoral Commission has commented that the punishment is, in their view, insufficient. I agree. I suspect, as do the 200,000 petitioners, that is the force of the petition. But that is the law as it stands at the moment, which makes the jump in the first sentence of the petition quite a leap, from if the law has been broken to it nullifies the result. That may be what many of us would like the law to be, but I'm afraid it isn't the way it is in this case. Or is it? A recurring theme in this debate is that no one is entirely sure. And the legal debate, and there are going to be lawyers in this room who are going to know far more than me, but one aspect of it begins with the status of the referendum itself. According to the Supreme Court judgment made in December 2016, when the government was being challenged on the need for parliamentary approval to trigger Article 50, it was judged that the EU referendum was not legally binding, but advisory. So logically, it cannot be ordered to be rerun by a court. This decision for whether or not to go back to the public after a referendum, that isn't a legal judgment, it's a political one. The decision lies with us. I will certainly give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and for speaking in this very important debate. And I speak as somebody whose constituency voted for Remain. I myself also voted for Remain. But could he address this particular point? He's mentioned rightly that the referendum in legal terms was advisory, not legally binding. And therefore, the triggering of Article 50, the triggering of Article 50 is therefore a weaker nexus to the referendum in and of itself than had the referendum been legally binding. And so therefore, does that not weaken the case for the referendum result to be overturned or for Article 50 to be rescinded, because in fact, Parliament's making an even more independent judgment than would otherwise have been the case?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his intervention. As I rather thought, we'll almost immediately start getting pulled in to the legal arguments. And the point he makes is a reasonable one, but of course there are arguments back and forth both ways, and many of these things, as so often, remain to be tested in court. So he might make that case. I think the point I am making is that, and this will be a theme I return to throughout, is that the law is for the lawyers, but actually a lot of these ultimately are going to be political judgments that need to be in this place. So we could make a choice as to whether, on the basis of what we have seen happened in the referendum, that we think it should be run again or not. It is up to us to do so. So I certainly will.
Giving way. On the point of the law, would he agree with me that it's essential that we have clarity on where the law stands, and particularly in relation to Article 50 and whether it can be rescinded? And I'm not sure whether he's aware of a legal case, the Whiteman case, going through the Scottish courts, which I'm sort of peripherally involved with, which is seeking to get a case to the CJEU for them to rule once and for all on whether Article 50 can be rescinded, because we need that clarity in terms of the other decisions that we have to take in this place.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I very much agree, and I am actually coming to that a bit further, but it is a very important point, and of course it would have been very helpful, perhaps for all of us, if the government had pursued that option to make it clearer so that we could all make a sensible decision. But another theme of this is the lack of clarity throughout, and I suspect that's not going to change in the immediate future. Now, I do not intend to re-rehearse the arguments around the abuses that were alleged to have happened during the referendum campaign, in fact in some cases proven to happen during the referendum campaign. Say others may wish to do so. I just note a couple of pieces from the excellent work done by the DCMS Select Committee in uncovering the extent of the wrongdoing committed by the Vote Leave campaign, which is of course the subject of this petition. And I cannot help but quote one reflection from their report in relation to one of the key players. They say that Mr Cummings' contemptuous behaviour is unprecedented in the history of this committee's inquiries and underlines concerns about the difficulties of enforcing cooperation with parliamentary scrutiny in the modern age. And beyond highlighting the lack of respect shown for the rules and procedures of this Parliament by Vote Leave, the Electoral Commission's legal counsel stated that Vote Leave has resisted our investigation from the start, including contesting our right as a statutory regulator to open the investigation. It has refused to cooperate, refused our request to put forward a representative for interview, and forced us to use our legal powers to compel it to provide evidence. So, Roger, of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and could I congratulate him on his opening speech in this debate, which is excellent, and ask him, would he agree with me that the impact of social media in these questions of attending committees and the close scrutiny that we need to have, not just on ourselves as members of Parliament, but on elections in general, that the social media element of this, because it's so new, is adding confusion and layers of fake news to all of this as well, which makes it even more difficult to get to the bottom of what the truth is for your average citizen or voter.
Daniel Zeichner.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her observation. I don't think anyone would really dispute the layers of complexity and difficulty and the greater difficulty presented by social media. For some of us who've been grappling with electoral law over many years, it makes it a whole lot more difficult, and I suspect we all know that we're going to need to update our procedures to try and cope with the challenges that they pose.
On that point,
I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point, because for many of my constituents this feels like an obvious point. There's been a breach in the law. There should be a way in which that should be held to account through our legal system. And so the fact that if this was a general election, local election, European election, local referendum election, it would be voided in the High Court, but not in this case, seems nonsensical. And to the point that my honourable friend just made, clearly the rules therefore need updating. So would he support me and others in calling for an inquiry, not just to understand the problems in this referendum, but to fix the rules for the future?
Zeichner.
Again, grateful to my honourable friend, and he's jumping ahead to my conclusions a little, as entirely correctly. What I'm going to be showing over the next few minutes, I hope, are some of the inconsistencies and the need for us to update our rules and laws, and I'm very much hoping that the Minister will be listening closely. But I'm going to take you back to the DCMS Select Committee conclusion. I think it was an extraordinarily strong statement that, frankly, should make anyone in any way associated with the Vote Leave campaign at least wince. Frankly, they should more properly be deeply ashamed. And I can't help noting that the alleged point of this entire Leave campaign was supposed to be bringing control back to this Parliament, a Parliament that they are now treating with contempt and disdain. The sheer hypocrisy, as well as the appalling boorishness they exhibited, takes the breath away. How dare they? How dare they wave the Union Jack when they so disrespect basic British values? And millions of people who voted to leave will have been horrified by their behaviour. And as my honourable friend, the member for Streatham, put it succinctly when asking his urgent question on this very matter in July, who do these people think they are? They think they are above the law. However, just because this particular instance was controversial, unpleasant, and stinks of arrogance and obnoxious disregard for our politics and our Parliament, and over an issue that is extremely emotional for many of us, as well as highly significant for the country, I would say it's also important to remember that this is not the only occasion on which our politics has fallen short. Now, I've just made a pretty strong attack, so I'm going to try and lighten the mood for a moment. And in the interest of painting an accurate picture, I fully acknowledge that claims that ballots have been rigged or that electorates have been misled are hardly new or unusual. It wasn't just the notorious £350,000 on the side of the bus claim. Million. Sorry, not thousands. I've lost count of the number of constituencies and by-elections I've turned up to and, frankly, been puzzled and amused by the information being offered to the electorate by one side or another. Let me get my mea culpa in first. My party has made some interesting claims. I remember Vote Labour or the Fox Gets It dominating one particularly parliamentary by-election. I remember Labour claiming that the Lib Dems were high on taxes and soft on drugs was one of my particular favourites. I think that was from Alderman Saddleworth. And in another, possibly in Leicester, I remember being told the contest was about Mr Strong versus Mr Weak. Neither of those candidates appeared on the ballot paper, as I recall. Of course, in general elections, Sir Roger, the Conservatives have used the notorious double tax whammy. They've asked us, are you thinking what we're thinking? And of course, whenever the Liberal Democrats are involved, it is always a two-horse race, whatever the facts might say. Now, whether you find any of these witty or making a reasonable point in a clever way or just downright misleading, none of these actually break the law. Vote Leave did break the rules. and they should be punished, and they have been punished according to the law as it stands, but they also seriously misled the public. And I and many others feel furious about the false promises that were made. But I would reluctantly concede that this motley collection of attempts to at best divert, at worst mislead the electorate is, frankly, what electoral politics has always been, an unlovely struggle to achieve sometimes noble ends through too often distinctly tawdry means. But sometimes, and this picks up the point made by my honourable friend, cheating does lead to a rerun. In Oldham, East and Saddleworth, a by-election was triggered in November 2010 after the sitting MP, elected just months before, was reported guilty of knowingly making false statements about an opponent in the general election earlier in the year. After various court proceedings and an appeal, he was reaffirmed as guilty and conceded defeat, and a by-election was triggered. I was very sorry, because he was a Labour colleague. Interestingly, the electorate chose not to punish Labour at the ensuing by-election. And there are more recent examples. In South Thanet, accusations of electoral fraud have been made that could have declared the election result in 2015 void due to overspending. This trial has been delayed and is expected to happen in October, and I don't think it would be appropriate to say anything more about it. But those who have signed the petition under consideration today may well ask, why are parliamentary election reports of wrongdoing treated so differently and so much more robustly to those rules that apply to referenda? Well, the answer, as I've already hinted, is that the electoral law is complicated, with different overlapping pieces of legislation that makes it difficult, even for those of us who have been struggling to work out what it means, to understand it over many years. The important point here is that electoral law is different for national referendums. Now, in the case of a parliamentary election, there can be a challenge, as my honourable friend has pointed out. There can be challenged for one of three reasons. If there had been administrative failings that could have led to the wrong result, if a candidate is suspected of being disqualified from being allowed to stand, or if there have been corrupt or illegal practices, which does include a candidate spending over the limit. And although there are financial limits on national spending by political parties and third-party campaigners during an election, there is no similar provision for declaring a general election result void because of overspending at the national scale. This makes the rules here both complex and varied for referenda and parliamentary elections.
Would my honourable
Certainly.
Would my honourable friend, I thank my honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. Would my honourable friend agree that whether or not we have another referendum on our membership of the European Union, the probable involvement of the Russians indicates that democracy in this country is at risk, and that whatever action we take in this House, we should try to ensure that it is motivated by our desire to defend democracy as well as the rule of law?
Zeichner.
I thank my honourable friend and near neighbour, and very much agree with him. There are so many aspects of this that could be explored today. I suspect others will choose to pursue some of them during the debate, but I very much agree with him on his point. But going back to the general proposition about how these issues should be dealt with, some do look for guidance on referenda to the Venice Commission, to which the UK is a signatory. It includes the following in its guidelines for constitutional referenda. It says, national rules on both public and private funding of political parties and election campaigns must be applicable to referendum campaigns. As in the case of elections, funding must be transparent, particularly when it comes to campaign accounts. In the event of a failure to abide by the statutory requirements, for instance, if the cap on spending is exceeded by a significant margin, the vote must be annulled. However, as colleagues may agree, some of that, too, is open to interpretation. It does not give precise advice, and the key point, I'm afraid, is it is not legally binding on its signatories, although we have signed up to the spirit of it, and it really ought to guide us in that way, it would seem to me. But it does seem that there's one clear conclusion and recommendation from this debate. It should be that the current rules are inconsistent, and certainly not clear to the general public. The law on referenda should be strengthened and made consistent, and I very much hope the Minister will address this point in his contribution. But I'd say there's a further issue that goes beyond the strict application of the law. We don't have a written constitution. We do not have a contract between citizens or subjects, but that's a debate for another day. Let's call them electors, and those entrusted to make law and to govern. I'd say we have a very British understanding, and I'd also say arguably it's probably served us pretty well. If a party is elected on a manifesto which it then contradicts in government by U-turning on key flagship policies, for instance. They can be reduced by the electorate from a party of government to one struggling to make up double figures in its number of MPs, as we have seen in recent times. It is also, I think, widely understood that we all respect the outcomes of elections, however disappointed we might be in the result. I speak from some experience here, having lost many more elections than I have won. But that respect requires that everyone has played broadly by the rules. And despite the examples I gave earlier, somewhat grudgingly, most of us, I think, accept that most of the time our system works. Now, I'm being quite generous here, because many of us, particularly on my side of the political spectrum, do feel that the levels of hostility from national newspapers owned by people with vested interests have over many years made any contest far from fair. But I still persist in thinking that the removal van outside Downing Street remains a powerful symbol of a democracy which still maintains public trust and consent. But, and this goes to the heart of the issue raised by the petition, if that trust begins to be put in doubt and significant numbers no longer feel the system is operating sufficiently fairly, then our democracy is at risk. And what we do about that is a political judgment, not a legal judgment. I will.
I thank him for giving way, and I apologise that I and possibly other members won't be able to stay to the end of this debate, because, of course, there's another debate about the European Union with the withdrawal agreement that's going to take place in the Chamber shortly. But I just wanted to ask him whether he thought that the idea of having an independent arbiter to assess the statements that are made during election campaigns might be helpful, and also whether perhaps politicians of all parties should perhaps voluntarily sign up, for instance, to the understanding that if the UK Statistics Authority came down against a particular statement, such as the £350 million for the NHS, saying that is untrue, that politician would never restate that position.
Zeichner.
I thank the honourable gentleman's point. I quite understand there's another more attractive option in terms of the other chamber coming up soon, so I'm in no way offended if he leaves. But on his point about whether there can be an independent arbiter, I have to say I'm slightly dubious about that. I think we've all sufficiently experienced, even in local contests, to know that that would be quite a difficult thing to set up, and I would worry about I think we've also all seen examples of when all candidates are given an equal space in a booklet, and have perhaps noted that isn't necessarily the bit that cuts through to the electorate in comparison with the reporting from other sources. So I think this is a difficult area, and I would have some scepticism. Although on the checking of statistics, there may be some value in exploring that. I think my honourable friend has a contribution.
He's very generous in giving way a second time to myself. Would he agree with me, however, that there should be a recommendation that if there is a referendum and if the government of the day says that it is going to implement whatever the people decide, that there should at least be a briefing in the library of the House of Commons the day after, so that those of us who are rather surprised by the result know what the government intends to do after the referendum goes one way or the other?
Zeichner.
I thank my honourable friend for her suggestion. I'm just remembering some of the bleary-eyed politicians in the middle of the night trying to recalibrate and wondering just how quickly such a briefing note could be produced accurately. I suspect, and this is a theme really of what I've been saying, is I'm not sure one can design legal systems to cope with all these things. In the end, they are political judgments, and we live in a democracy where there's a fair amount of hurly-burly, a free press as it should be. But what we don't want is our elections and decisions being bought by money and external states. Yeah. And that is, I think, the worry and the difference from some of the problems that we've had in the past. So I'd like to make some progress, Sir Roger, and move on to the separate but related question of Article 50 and the ongoing debate as to whether it is rescindable. Lord Kerr, who is of course frequently quoted on this, who was responsible for drafting Article 50 as Secretary-General to the European Convention in 2002-3, said last year that Article 50 is revocable, and this interpretation was supported by Jean-Claude Perry, former legal counsel to the European Council. QC's Mary Demetriou, Jessica Seymour and Tim Ward have written a joint legal opinion which they've sent to the Prime Minister, in which they too conclude that Article 50 can be withdrawn before the 29th of March 2019 without the need to seek the agreement of the other EU member states, and that if this happens, the UK would retain its membership and privileges. The joint legal opinion notes that the wording in Article 50 refers to a decision to notify an intention to withdraw. The QCs argue that an intention is not a binding commitment. It can be changed or withdrawn. So while legal arguments continue on this matter, in political terms, it has also been stated by the French government they'd welcome the UK to stay in the EU on its current terms, and EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and Council President Donald Tusk have both said that Brexit is reversible. Well, of course, lots of people have said lots of things over a period of time. I suspect it is, when it comes down to it, the political will of lawmakers that counts here. But that has been made very clear. We are welcome to stay, should we wish to. Sir Roger, I've been trying to present this position in an even-handed and fair way, even though everyone already knows where I'm going with it. June the 2016 was not, I think, in many people's view, a great example of a mature democracy working at its best. We know that in our system, referenda are used mainly by prime ministers who are in a fix, generally trapped by divisions within their own party. This was most certainly the case in 2016. Although I have to say I have not an ounce of sympathy for David Cameron, he must every day wonder how it came to this. In 2016, the country was hideously divided on the issue, but a decision was made. 2.5 years on, it looks as though we face another very difficult decision, to accept whatever deal can finally be arrived at, or not. But that's a different question from that posed in 2016. I have argued this afternoon that the law around referenda should be changed to make them consistent with other electoral processes. Almost 200,000 petitioners, and I suspect many, many more in the country, feel very strongly that the 2016 decision, close as it was sullied by actions which have been proven by the Electoral Commission to be unlawful. Now, it may well be Parliament's responsibility or fault that the law is inconsistent, but many of the public, many of the people we represent, feel that the law has not provided adequate recompense for wrongdoings, and that is the force of this petition. That the law was broken is not in doubt, but alongside that, many believe that the campaign was grossly misleading. What was offered by Vote Leave and other Leave campaigners is not what is being delivered. And as with parties that renege on their manifestos, the country will not forgive the political system and the politicians who allowed this to happen. The two strands, breaking spending limits and misleading people, are separate issues, but for many, many people, the two are inextricably linked. Indeed, the Right Honourable Member for Mid Sussex, the grandson of Winston Churchill, told the House in the urgent question on this matter in July that one of the great glories of this sadly now diminished country was our electoral and democratic system. I say that if we are to retain the integrity and trust of the voting public, the whole damn thing needs to be blown and started all over again. Now, the point is very well made. I believe that to maintain trust in our democracy, a political response is needed. And that political response is to ensure that justice is done and that we have a people's vote. The petition itself mentions Article 10.3 of the Lisbon Treaty and says every citizen shall have the right to participate in the democratic life of the Union. Decisions shall be taken as openly and as closely as possible to the citizen. I don't want to leave the EU. I've been very explicit on this point. I truly believe that the economic, social and political damage that leaving would do to our country, hitting the most vulnerable the hardest, could be mitigated by remaining in and reforming the European Union. Tackling the underlying causes here at home is the way to truly bring back control to the people, not to the bankrollers of election campaigns. But while having this conversation about our future relationship with the European Union, it is worth reflecting on that Article 10.3. Decisions shall be taken as openly and as closely as possible to the citizen. This was not what happened in the EU referendum campaign. With electoral rules being broken, a limited franchise which excluded those that it would most affect, a question which allowed people to vote on what they didn't want, but then said nothing about what kind of relationship should be put in its place. As many have said, as we slam the door, shouting, "We're leaving," we are unable to answer the obvious retort. So where do you think you're going to? So, Roger, to help our fractured society move back towards those higher ideals of genuine informed participation in democratic life, it is right to consider the experiences of the last 2.5 years since the country went to the polls, as well as the poll itself, to look at what was promised then and what is being delivered now. It is right to wonder whether we can do better. People have the right to know the price tag before they pay the bill. I am absolutely convinced we can do better. We all know so much more now than we did back in 2016. My solution to the conundrum raised by the 200,000 petitioners is simple. We have an opportunity not to revisit 2016, not a rerun despite the wrongdoing, but a new vote on the issue that lies before us, a people's vote, a genuine choice for the people to decide their future on whether to take the deal, whatever is negotiated, or to reject it, and so stay in the European Union.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 223729 relating to rescinding Article 50 if the Vote Leave campaign broke electoral laws. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Sir Roger. A pleasure to see you in the chair as always. I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, my long-standing friend, the member for Cambridge, for a sterling introduction to this petition. I'm sure my colleagues will be pleased to know that I'm going to be very brief with my contribution because I think he said a lot of what I would have said. I also want to thank the 555 constituents of mine in East Bristol who have put their name to this petition. I was one of the 122 MPs, 57 of them Labour, who voted against triggering Article 50 in February last year. And every day that goes by, in my mind, vindicates that position, that I was right to do so. The government had no plan for Brexit then and has no realistic Brexit plan now. And triggering Article 50, when the Prime Minister did, began the countdown to the biggest changes our country has faced in peacetime. It was an incredibly serious decision and one that should not have been taken lightly. Once the Prime Minister's letter reached President Tusk's desk in Brussels, it strictly limited the time for negotiations to 2 years, and we know that that clock is ticking down, and it feels like it's ticking down ever faster by the moment. Even with a coherent Brexit plan in place, this would be a challenging deadline to meet, but the government was totally and utterly unprepared. It simply hadn't done its homework. And it was painfully obvious when ministers came before select committees, such as when the Environmental Audit Committee, on which I sit, conducted an inquiry into chemicals regulation post-Brexit. When the minister came in front of us, it became clear that they were only just starting to ask the chemicals industry what Brexit would mean for them. And this was after Article 50 had been triggered. The conversations that needed to be had with industry, with important sectors, with the much derided experts had barely started. And so triggering Article 50 was reckless in the extreme. And the Prime Minister wasn't doing it because Brussels insisted we move to trigger or in an attempt to unite our divided country after the difficult referendum campaign. She was doing it in a futile attempt to keep her warring cabinet together. And we can all see now how well that's been going. There is little serious doubt that Article 50 is revocable, although I know it wasn't envisaged when it was actually drafted. European Council President Donald Tusk reiterated last year that no Brexit is still an option for the UK government. And the author of Article 50, Lord Carr, has said that the UK could still opt to stay in the EU. He said, at any stage we can change our minds if we want to, and if we did, we know that our partners would actually be very pleased indeed. But today's debate...
For giving way. Would you agree with me that if the government want to be transparent and open about this, they should very clearly state whether, in their view, Article 50 is or is not revocable? As far as I'm aware, the position they've adopted so far is the question isn't being posed, therefore we're not going to answer it. But actually, they should, and they should put it on the record.
McCarthy.
I absolutely agree with that. We're discussing all the options available to us at the moment, from no deal to some of us advocating that we ought to think better and do all we can to try and stay in the EU. And clearly, looking at the legalities around Article 50 is in everyone's interest so that we know actually which options are still on the table and which ones are not. But as I was about to say, that today's debate isn't really about the rights and wrongs of triggering Article 50, although that is something that the petitioners have put forward as part of their call. It is about vote leaves, illegal activities during the referendum. And though they have been held to account, a fine of £60,000 is absolutely pitiful. It is not a deterrent at all when so much was at stake during the referendum campaign and when the people involved in the campaign are so wealthy, have access easily to the funds that would be needed to pay this fine. I support the Electoral Commission's call for greater fines to be levied on those who break the law in this way, and my honourable friend, the member for Bristol North West's call for a judge-led inquiry into the conduct of the referendum. My right honourable friend for Exeter has led the way in investigating the Russian connections of Aaron Banks' Leave.eu campaign, and I was glad to be a signatory on a letter he organised to the Metropolitan Police and the National Crime Agency, urging them to investigate the links between Vote Leave and Leave EU. It's been reported that Aaron Banks met Russian officials multiple times. I think on one occasion it was reported that he'd met them 11 times before the Brexit vote. The report's now an investigation by the National Crime Agency. What we are seeing is the destruction of our democracy by foreign funding, by fake news, and by very wealthy individuals that are prepared to play fast and loose with our electoral law and get away with it with impunity. I do not believe that this law breaking alone is reason to rescind Article 50 if the intention in calling for Article 50 to be revoked is to rerun the 2016 referendum campaign. Nor are the arguments put forward about a lack of information or indeed the deluge of misleading information when voters made their choice in 2016 a valid reason to call for a rematch. Democracy is never perfect. We can never really second guess why people voted the way they did. I would prefer not to turn the clock back and talk about rerunning the 2016 referendum, but I do very much support the need to properly scrutinise any deal that the government comes forward, possibly with a people's vote if the government does not come forward with a deal that is acceptable to Parliament. Some of us spent the campaign warning the Brexit process was much more complicated than some would have it. We've now gone from being told that Brexit would be the easiest deal in human history to the Prime Minister saying it's not the end of the world if we leave with no deal. The promises have evaporated. I believe that, as I said, rather than turning the clock back and looking to scrap in Article 50, yes, we certainly need to hold to account the people who are responsible for illegal actions during the referendum campaign. They should not be allowed to get away with this with impunity. But the important thing now is to look at the deal that will, if it's possible to scrutinise the deal because it's such an absolute mess at the moment. But the important thing is to focus on the here and now and to make sure that we either get the absolute best deal or a soft Brexit for this country, or we think again, we extend or rescind Article 50 and we go back to the drawing board.
Martin Day.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Sir Roger. I am also grateful for the member for Cambridge for opening today's debate on behalf of the Petition Committee. With only 200 days until the UK is scheduled to leave the EU, time is clearly of the essence in regards to this issue. And I would commend him for being so generous with his time and taking interventions today. I think we may have suffered from participants in today's debate due to the competing EU debate which is about to begin in the main chamber. However, the members who have spoken, I think, have covered just about every aspect of that's salient to this issue today. I'm also grateful for his comprehensive presentation, and there is much that I would agree with him on. I'm grateful in particular for him reminding us that the referendum was advisory and that it was not legally binding. However, much of the decisions before us will be about political judgment. Members have raised the point that adequate legal advice whether Article 50 can be rescinded would be extremely useful, especially in relation to future decisions which will have to be made. And we will need to wait for the decision of the Inner House of the Court of Session in due course to see if it tells us that. We can be in no doubt that there have been illegal activities by Vote Leave. The Electoral Commission has determined that the electoral rules have been broken, and both Vote Leave and Be Leave have been fined and referred to the police. Now, I do not wish to pontificate about what may or may not happen with regard to ongoing police investigations. That is for them to determine, and a due process will take place. It is, however, enough to acknowledge that it is right that the matter has been referred to the police, and we must let that investigation take due course. What I will comment on is how inadequate the powers of the Electoral Commission appear to be in relation to this matter. If we are to have confidence in the integrity and outcome of referendums and elections, it is essential that we have transparency in the process. It is particularly disappointing that Vote Leave had displayed an arrogant and uncooperative stance, forcing the Electoral Commission to use its legal powers to compel it to provide evidence. It is bad enough that this attitude demonstrates that Vote Leave thought they were above the law, but this is compounded by the paltry level of fines imposed, totalling £61,000 against a multi-million-pound campaign, something which can be dismissed as a cost of doing business, almost with impunity. Unlike with parliamentary constituencies where results can be declared void as a result of overspending by successful candidates, there is no such provision for overturning the result in the referendum. Indeed, the only provision for challenging the referendum result was by judicial review within 6 weeks of the result, clearly unsatisfactory, given that it took almost 13 months before the Electoral Commission published its report into the lead Vote Leave campaign funding and spending, and that is no way a criticism of the Electoral Commission. I would suggest for future that this period needs to be significantly longer in future referendums and could be further aided by a more transparent, real-time declaration of expenses and donations. This is something that seriously needs consideration by ministers for going forward. Vote Leave, of course, was not alone in being fined by the Electoral Commission. Leave.uk was also fined, totalling £70,000 in May of this year, and offences were also referred to the police, once again highlighting the inadequacy of the range of fines available to the Electoral Commission. Indeed, it would be fair to point out that several participants on the Remain side of the referendum have also been fined, but in each case, significantly lower levels of potential fines were imposed, and more significantly, without any individuals being referred to the police. All of which, however, does add to the perception that the existing electoral laws are simply not fit for purpose. There has been talk of respecting the result of the referendum, to use the phrase in the government's response to the petitioners. But what exactly does that mean? Take Scotland, for example, a nation which we were constantly assured was an equal partner in the Union in the 2014 referendum, where people voted overwhelmingly to remain by 62% to 38%, yet Scotland is being dragged out of the EU against our wishes, the peril of being part of an incorporating union with a much larger partner. Now, clearly, that example indicates that respecting the result of the referendum can be interpreted differently by different members. So what about respecting the process of the referendum to achieve a fair result? Surely that is more important. And if the result is not fair, should that result be respected? Well, I would argue that it should not, and that there are many reasons that can be used to support this position, most importantly being what happens in future contests if campaigners can get away with cheating the rules. There must be full transparency to hold any of those who seek to influence and/or undermine our democracy to account, which brings me on to another dimension of this debate, that of dark money. BBC Spotlight Northern Ireland has revealed the former Vice-Chairman of the Conservative Party in Scotland, now Chair of the Constitutional Research Council, Richard Cook, was behind the DUP's £435,000 donation during the EU referendum, and to use their words, has a trail of involvement in illegal activity and foreign money. Donation rules in Northern Ireland mean that details about donations made before July 2017 remain hidden. And it is worth noting in response to the BBC that the Electoral Commission continues to urge the UK Government to bring forward legislation enabling the publishing of information on donations from January 2014. We need a full debate on the Scottish Conservative dark money, as we've only seen the tip of the dodgy donations iceberg. And the SNP have serious concerns around the issue of dark money handled by the Scottish Tories in the 2016 referendum. We've repeatedly called on the Scottish Conservatives and the Prime Minister to reveal the full details of the transactions between the DUP and the Scottish Tory-linked CRC. They continue to refuse to do so. Perhaps the Minister today will enlighten us. Why is the original source of this dark money being kept a secret? In conclusion, our electoral laws must not be treated as an optional extra by campaigns. The £250 to £20,000 fines available to the Electoral Commission simply are inadequate. Fines should be unlimited or at the very least proportionate to the spending ability of the party or campaign group involved. We have to ask ourselves what level of electoral rule-breaking should invalidate this or indeed any future referendum, and the answer to that question is not a simple matter. Given what we've heard, can we have confidence that the outcome of the EU referendum was secure? The issues of overspending, The issues of deliberate coordination of expenditure, dark money, possible foreign interference, fake news and potential misuse of online data, all of which have played a part in the EU referendum, and all of which leave an unpalatable taste in the mouth, will lead many of the public to conclude that the referendum was won by cheating. There is much which needs to be addressed to ensure public confidence in our democracy. Pressing on regardless fails to ensure this, and surely now is the time to stop the process of national self-harm and remain within the EU. What we should concentrate on instead is making our democratic systems fit for purpose in this modern digital age. Thank you.
Paul Blumfield. Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure, as ever, to be able to wind up this debate for the opposition with you in the chair. And I'd like to commend my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, for the way he opened the debate at a time when much of the debate in this place on this issue lets us down. I thought he made a very balanced, informed, and at times entertaining contribution. So I'm grateful to him for that. And I should acknowledge that 671 of my constituents signed the petition, probably many of whom campaigned alongside me to remain in the European Union, and I've been in correspondence with a number of them on this issue. And I really do understand the anger and frustration that they feel about cheating in this referendum. Now, clearly that anger and frustration has been made all the worse as they have watched the deepening chaos of this government's handling of the negotiations and the growing risk of a disastrous no-deal Brexit. Something which, of course, has been anticipated with some excitement by the extremists of the European Research Group. Although I note, actually, and I don't know whether others did, that the Secretary of State for International Trade this morning confessed in an article in the Times that he, and I quote, can't promise life will be rosy after Brexit. Something of a contrast with the pledges that were made during the referendum. Now, we should be clear. Labour backed to remain. I campaigned relentlessly to stay in the European Union, but the majority didn't agree. It was a close vote, painfully close vote, but it was a decision to leave. But the closeness of the vote indicates it wasn't a decision to rupture our relationship with the EU or to trash our economy. And if in July 2016 the Prime Minister had said that, if she'd said, we recognise the country is divided on the issue, we will leave but remain close in a customs union, close to the single market, members of the agencies and programmes we've built together over 45 years, she would have had an overwhelming majority in this House, could have united the country so bitterly divided by David Cameron's ill-conceived referendum, and could have avoided some of the anger and frustration which is behind this petition. But instead, she set red line after red line, putting the interests of her warring party before the interests of the country, as my honourable friend, the member for Bristol East, pointed out in relation to Article 50. And she was also right, incidentally, I think, to highlight that the tragedy of the Prime Minister now setting something better than the end of the world as the benchmark for her negotiations with the EU27. Now, of course, as other members have said, as we speak, there is a general debate just started in the Chamber on legislating for the withdrawal agreement, which in itself will unpick parts of the bill, which we spent a year debating in the House and now form the Withdrawal Act. But 27 months after the referendum and 1 month before the planned deadline for a deal, although that deadline is slipping, we're still no closer to knowing whether there will be a withdrawal agreement, or if there is, what will be in it. It did seem that Chequers marked a change of policy from the Prime Minister. Too little, too late, but at least a direction
Yet barely a week later, the government whipped intensively to defeat an amendment to the trade bill that endorsed the Chequers plan and embraced amendments to the customs bill from the European Research Group, which were designed to torpedo it. So, Roger, it's clear that Chequers has no support in the House, in Brussels, or even in the country. So we're faced with the most important negotiations this country has seen since the Second World War being led by the most dysfunctional government any of us can remember. So I will indeed.
I'm very grateful for him giving way.
It's entirely up to the honourable gentleman who has the floor to whom he gives way, and it is not up to the chair to seek to intervene in that process. But as a general rule, the chair does deprecate the fact that some honourable members choose to come into the chamber at or near the end of a debate. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Sir Roger, for that, and I fully accept your intervention. I really had another engagement that I could not get out of, but I do appreciate that he's giving way. Does he not agree with me that the main thing that is has been so reckless is the premature triggering of Article 50, which is why I very much welcome, actually, that this motion is in front of us now?
I take your point, Sir Roger, and I think that every aspect of the government's handling of these negotiations and the post-referendum process has been reckless. So I do sympathise with the frustration felt by the petitioners and want to turn very specifically to the subject of the petition. Now, of course, the serious findings by the Electoral Commission regarding vote leave have to be and are being fully investigated by the police. And both those running the organisation and all those associated with it at its heart should cooperate fully with the inquiry in a way which, as my old friend, a member for Cambridge, pointed out, was not the case during the Electoral Commission's own investigation. And so I hope that when he comes to wind up for the government, the Minister will agree that sitting and former government ministers who worked with vote leave during the referendum campaign must cooperate fully with the police investigation, and that their adherence to the ministerial code during their time working with vote leave should also be the subject of a full investigation. And I look forward to his comments on those points. Of course, it's vitally important that the investigation is allowed to take its course, and that includes the possibility of criminal charges. And at a time when trust in politics is low, and with the very real threat that fake news and disinformation pose to our democracy, and a number of members have made that point, dishonesty in our political system can't be brushed aside. Now, Article 50 has been triggered, beginning the 2-year process of our withdrawal, and my honourable friend, member for Cambridge, spent some time talking about it, but I accept the view that legally it can be revoked, recognising there is discussion around the question. It could be revoked if there was a political consensus that it should be. However, we can't revoke it on the basis of this petition. It's difficult to know exactly what influenced voters. The honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk said, I think, if I quote him rightly, that this election was won by cheating. This referendum was won by cheating. Clearly, there was cheating. What's not clear is that the referendum was won by it. And we can't be certain. And we can't credibly say that overspending in the region of £500,000 definitely swung the result one way or the other. We do need tough sanctions on those who break the law, and the Electoral Commission are right to seek much larger fines and much greater retribution on those who bring our democratic system into disrepute. And we need criminal prosecutions, as I say, where appropriate. Now, I understand why the petitioners would feel that it's nonsense, and again, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk made this point, that where cheating exists, the result should stand, and the example of Oldham East and Saddleworth was quoted by my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, the parliamentary election, which was overturned. But my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, also made the point that we have to be guided by the law. And while the law provides for that option in relation to parliamentary elections, it doesn't provide for that option in relation to referenda. Now, there is a case for a much wider inquiry, but as it stands at the moment, the case for overturning the referendum on this basis isn't made. Far from strengthening our democracy, disregarding the vote simply on the basis of this issue risks further undermining trust in our political system. That's why, as an opposition, our focus now is in pressing the government to reach out to the majority in the country, not the minority in their party, to reach a deal in the country's interests. Now, as an opposition, we've ruled nothing out, but our focus is on ensuring that the divisions in the Conservative Party don't lead us to crashing out of the European Union without a deal in the autumn. But if that deal does not meet our 6 tests on cooperation, on the economy, on migration, on rights and protections, on national security, and on the interests of the regions and nations, we will vote it down. The Prime Minister has said she accepts those tests, but time is running out for her to meet them.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and as ever, it is a huge pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Actually, I think this is the first time I have been a minister where you have been in the chair, and I hope I don't somehow get the wrath that you enacted on my Liberal Democrat friend earlier and hold completely in order throughout this debate. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Cambridge for opening the debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. He said in his own, I'm going to quote him, he said he'd opened it in an even-handed way, and actually he did, and I think he should be congratulated for that. I guess I could caveat it by saying relatively even-handed, but it was a very good job well done, and I congratulate him for representing the views of the people that signed the petition. And I'd also like to thank all those that participated in today's debate. A decent number of people, considering the competition in the main chamber of this place. Interventions from members from Hitchin and Harpenden, Carshall from Wallington, although the honourable gentleman's just gone. It's a shame he's gone, because I was fascinated by his idea of an independent arbiter to stop incorrect statements. I thought it was odd for a Lib Dem politician to attempt to silence his own party's election machine, but so be it. The honourable member for Bristol North West, Hornsey and Wood Green, actually the honourable lady and I debated during the European referendum in a room not too far away from here. And I'd like to think, had she been here now, she would at least agree with me that the debate we had was fairly well educated, or certainly the people in the audience were, and were informing the debate very well indeed, and was very, very balanced indeed. So there were good debates that happened during the referendum, and I'm sure many members here took part in them, participating on either side of the argument. Obviously, I'd like to thank the honourable member for Bristol East, and I do recognise her long-standing and very principled position on this matter of leaving the European Union, and she is a passionate pro-European, and I respect her for that completely. When I was a member of the European Parliament, I debated with lots of people in a similar position, and I never fell out with them once, because I understand completely that they have principled positions that they're sticking to. I just happen to disagree with that position. But I very much welcome what the honourable lady said about wishing to get a good deal for the country and scrutinising that deal when it comes before this House, and I thank her for those words. The honourable gentleman, the opposition spokesman from Linlithgow and East Falkirk, I have to thank him for his contribution. He made some interesting points, which actually were probably more for Cabinet Office ministers than for the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in the Department for Leaving the European Union. But I will pass them on because there are interesting points on the rules of referenda, similar to points made by the Honourable Gentleman for Cambridge. So I'll ensure they are passed on. So when a debate is had on the rules of referenda in the future, he can be assured that his points are being taken into account. And then I'd also like to thank, obviously, the opposition spokesman, a gentleman I've known for, alas, slightly too long, really. And again, I disagree with him on much of what he said, but I know that it comes from a principal position where he's passionate about this subject, and I do respect him for it. But I do welcome his comments about how Chequers has moved negotiations and this debate on, and it'll be interesting to see where we get to as an opposition party, where his party gets to in its debate on these matters. I tend to think, actually, that the majority of his constituents and my constituents are actually in a slightly different place to us, where no matter how they voted, that they just want this noisy debate to end and us to get on with the job of the very detailed job of leaving the European Union in March next year. And there was a great deal of passion which was expressed by the Honourable Gentleman for Cambridge about how people felt about this referendum result. And I remember it distinctly because in many constituencies here, possibly the Honourable Gentleman in Ipswich might recall this in his own, but there was the Pencilgate problems in the referendum where people were worried about marking a cross with the pencil because they thought the government might change how they were voting. So there was passion on both sides of this argument, and I think it would be foolish for us to ignore that passion. And I'd also like to thank all those that have signed the petition. It's a good-sized petition, 200,000 people, including nearly 300 people in my own seat of Daventry. And this petition calls for Article 50 to be revoked if it is found that electoral laws were broken in the 2016 referendum. And it highlights two issues: the conduct of the 2016 referendum and the revocation of our notice to withdraw from the European Union under Article 50, and I will deal with each in turn. Firstly, I emphasise that it is not acceptable for any organisation to breach electoral procedures, and it is regrettable that fines have been levied on multiple groups on both sides of the referendum campaign. Electoral law must be followed, and its breaches must be decisively dealt with, and the Electoral Commission's use of its sanctioning powers show that it is doing this vital job. But it did happen on both sides, I guess. A number of pro-Remain organisations have already been fined by the Electoral Commission for breaking referendum law, including the Liberal Democrats, Open Europe, Best for Our Future, and a host of others. But I understand that's not the nature of this petition. This issue, though, is rightly and effectively being dealt with through our legal system. It is being scrutinised through ongoing legal processes, even including legal challenges to the findings of the Electoral Commission. The police must consider whether or not there has been any breach of criminal law, and there must be due process and a fair hearing. And there is an important constitutional principle that politicians do not interfere with police investigations. That said, the government will be considering the wider implications of this issue, as well as recent reports on government policy on referenda and elections. We will carefully review the Electoral Commission's report on digital campaigning, the Information Commissioner's recommendations on the use of data in politics, and the DCMS Select Committee inquiry into fake news, and take necessary action to strengthen further our democracy. However, there is no question of whether the UK government will revoke its notification under Article 50. It is our clear policy that we will not revoke Article 50. The people of the United Kingdom gave a clear instruction, and the government is committed to seeing that through. We will leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year. Parliament overwhelmingly voted to put the question of the UK's membership of the European Union to the British electorate. The simple question that was put to members of the public on the 23rd of June 2016 asked, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? The result of the referendum, therefore, was a clear answer to a clear question, giving a clear directive to government to withdraw from the European Union, which we respected through our notification under Article 50. The result reflected not only campaigning, but considerable and prolonged debate at national and parliamentary level, underpinned by a commitment from all major parties, political parties, to respect the outcome of the vote. Almost 3/4 of the electorate took part in the referendum, resulting in 17,410,742 people voting to leave the European Union and 16,141,241 voting to remain. This is the highest number of votes cast for anything in UK electoral history. Parliament then overwhelmingly confirmed the result of the referendum by voting with clear and convincing majorities in both of its houses for the European Union notification of withdrawal bill. Further still, at the last general election, over 80% of the public voted for parties committed to respecting the Leave result. This government respects the views and wishes of the over 198,000 people who signed this petition, but the instruction received from the wider public and their elected parliament is one that cannot be ignored. The government is clear that the British people have voted to leave the European Union, and therefore that is what we shall do. As the former Secretary of State for exiting the European Union noted earlier this year, the electorate voted for a government to give them a referendum. Parliament voted to hold the referendum. The people voted in the referendum, and we are now honouring the result of that referendum as we said we would. The government has been and continues to be committed to delivering on the instruction given to us by the British people, working to overcome the challenges and seize the opportunities that this brings to deliver an outcome which betters the lives of British people, whether they voted to leave or to remain. The British people must be able to trust in its government both to effect their will and to deliver the best outcome for them. As the Prime Minister has said, this is more than the decision to leave the European Union. It's about whether the people can trust their politicians to put in place the decision they took. In upholding the directive to withdraw from the European Union, that is what this government has done and will continue to do. We recognise that to do otherwise would be to undermine the decision of the British people, and that would be to disrespect the powerful democratic values of this country and this government and this Parliament. This government's position remains clear. Our notice under Article 50 will not be withdrawn.
Daniel Zeigner to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Sir Roger. And on behalf of the Petitions Committee, can I thank all those members who made contributions. I think it's been a civilised debate. The Minister reflected that it was a decent turnout. I have to say I rather expected rather more. In fact, I rather expected a rank of Vote Leave supporters on the other side coming to explain their actions and to defend their actions. Now, I quite understand why they're not here, because, Sir Roger, their actions were indefensible. And what a pity that they're not here to defend themselves. I suspect many of the petitioners will actually be profoundly disappointed, not by the numbers who are here, but by the numbers, particularly on the Vote Leave side, who aren't. But the Minister can't be held responsible for everything that happens in life. So I would just reflect on his responses to one or two points. I was mildly encouraged that the government is planning to look at the role of data, at strengthening the laws around referendum. I think there are major lessons that can be learnt from all this. I was slightly disappointed that he didn't take the opportunity to endorse the suggestion from my honourable friend, the member for Bristol North West, that a judge-led inquiry into what had gone on might help us with that, but maybe that's for another day. In conclusion, Sir Roger, it was a strong statement from from the government, again, that this will not be revisited. I just reflect gently on the very strong statements from the Prime Minister through the early months of 2017 that there was no chance there'd be a general election. Maybe she should go for a walking holiday in Wales again and come back and give the country what it needs to get us off the hook of this crisis and deliver a people's vote.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 223729 relating to rescinding Article 50 of the Vote Leave campaign if the Vote Leave campaign broke electoral laws. Any of that opinion say aye? Contrary, no? The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.